We knew that we were being hunted by the Special Branch Secret Police and also by MI5. We were pretty high-level targets at that point, so we knew the extent of the resources they could use against us. We knew that the flat was probably bugged, electronic communications were bugged, computers, phones, that sort of thing. We knew there was a possibility we might be followed around on the streets, and we also knew there was a possibility that some of our friends would be recruited to report back on us. I was born and raised in a little island called Guernsey, which is part of the Channel Islands off the coast of France. British, but very close to France. I got a scholarship to a public school, and then I got a scholarship to Cambridge. So I ended up having quite a sort of elite type education, I suppose is the best way of putting it.
What was your career path? What did you want to do?
You go to Cambridge and it's sort of an ends to a means, really. It's the sort of golden ticket into the British establishment if you want it. I quite fancied being a diplomat when I was young, and applied to the Foreign Office. And then I had a letter from the Ministry of Defence, allegedly, saying there may be other jobs you'd find more interesting. Please call this number. So I did, and then got involved in a very long recruitment process. And 10 months later, I found myself walking through the front door of MI5 to start work there as an intelligence officer. So in the UK, there are three main intelligence agencies. First of all, there's MI5, which is officially known as the UK Domestic Security Service, which is there to protect us against threats within this country, counter-espionage, counter-terrorism, that sort of thing. There is MI6, which is officially known as the Secret Intelligence Service. That's the sort of James Bond foreign intelligence agency. And there's also the Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, which is based down in Cheltenham. And that is the listening post. It eavesdrops on all of us. And it's a very strange feeling to have access to all this secret information. You know, you're reading people's private communications, or you are briefing and debriefing human agents who are infiltrating groups, or you are tasking mobile surveillance officers or static surveillance officers to spy on people. And it feels really odd to begin with, but actually within a few months it becomes perfectly normal. That's just a day job. The other big thing, though, when you join something like MI5, is that even during the recruitment process, you are not allowed to tell people where you're being recruited. So we were allowed to tell our partners or very close family or our best friends if we trusted them. That was it. So MI5 in the 1990s was shutting down a lot of the work they had been doing for the previous 80 years, like counter-espionage against Russia, which is a little premature perhaps nowadays, looking at what's going on, and also counter-subversion, and they were beginning to move into primarily looking at counter-terrorism. You are basically given a target to investigate. It could be a country of interest, it could be a terrorist organisation, subversive organisation, it could be an embassy if you're looking for counter-espionage work and things like that. You have the target, you gather information and secret intelligence on that target using a variety of secret means, and then you get all the information coming in, assess it, and then advise on what action to take. I mean, it might be drop the investigation, there's no threat, or it might be we need to take action now, go in and arrest someone now because they're about to plant a bomb.
So what was your first job assignment at MI5? You're 22, you're joining, what's your first assignment?
My first posting was to a little section called F2, and that was counter-subversion, i.e. MI5 investigating people for their political beliefs and political activism within the UK. So there were hundreds of thousands of files held on UK citizens for being members potentially of the Communist Party or Trotskyist groups or far-right groups. MI5 became incredibly paranoid after the Cambridge spy ring scandal, which was a bunch of establishment types who betrayed the country in the 1950s and 60s, Burgess, Philby, McLean, people like that. So they got very paranoid about infiltration and subversion by particularly the Soviet Union, but also other hostile states.
So you've mentioned about your second posting that it was related to IRA.
It was there that I met my former partner and colleague, a man who became a very notorious whistleblower called David Shayler. So I worked there on political subversion and on Irish terrorism and also on international terrorism. We had some good results, but there were also mistakes made. Bombs that could and should have been prevented went off on UK streets. Innocent people died, which is bad enough. But then MI5 refused to learn from their mistakes.
Which bombings do you think could have been prevented?
Yeah, there was a huge lorry bomb called Bishopsgate in 1993.
And MI5 knew about it.
They bungled the early investigation into it, so it could have been prevented.
So your third posting was investigating international terrorism, am I right? Can you explain what were the cases you've investigated?
Well, this was mainly, again, going back to David Shayler, because he was the primary whistleblower when we decided to go public about our concerns. And he, at that time, was the head of the Libyan desk. There are three key cases that we heard of and witnessed when we were in G Branch, the International Terrorism Section. First of all was an illegal telephone tap of a prominent Guardian journalist. The second one was a case of a miscarriage of justice. Two Palestinian students based in London were convicted of conspiracy to bomb the Israeli embassy in 1994. And MI5 had documents which they did not disclose to the defence. And if they had disclosed the documents, it's probable that the jury would not have convicted these two young people. So they covered up and continued to cover up this miscarriage of justice for many years. And in fact, the two students ended up serving 15 years in prison each. It was an appalling case. But the final case, and this is why we actually resigned and why we went public, became known as the Gaddafi assassination plot. This was a case where MI6 had a walk-in, a volunteer, who said that he had a group of people who wanted to try and topple Gaddafi in 1996. They needed support from MI6, and they needed money and even just weaponry to try and effect the coup. And MI6 started paying huge amounts of money to this organisation. And the attack did indeed go ahead. But the explosion had gone off underneath the wrong car, killing innocent people and also innocent bystanders as they sort of, stood to watch the cavalcade go by. So we did raise a lot of our concerns on the inside. We were told to just shut up and just follow orders. And that's when we resigned in the mid-1990s to blow the whistle on a series of spy crimes. It took a while to set up because there was a mutual distrust between the media and the whistleblower. So that trust has to be built up. And we became more and more paranoid about how much we might be being spied on ourselves if they were getting suspicious about what we intended to do. So we couldn't tell any of our friends or our family or anyone, give any warning to anyone. Having said that, for anyone coming out of the intelligence agencies or central government or the military, you are also risking prison because you are going to be automatically breaching the terms of the Official Secrets Act 1989. So even if you are reporting the spies' crimes, you will be the one who goes to prison. So knowing that, knowing the risks we were taking and knowing the fact that we would become unemployable meant that there was a lot of soul-searching before we took the decision. But we felt we had no option but to try and speak out. So rather than sitting around waiting in our flat for the knock on the door from the secret police and being hauled off to prison for a couple of years on remand, awaiting trial, we decided to leave the country and went on the run around Europe for a month without giving any warning to our friends and our family. So the first they heard about it was when they saw the front pages of all the newspapers and David's picture sort of smiling out at them. So that was a huge shock for a lot of people.
So what was your escape plan?
Fairly easy, assuming that they weren't already onto us. Just get the last flight out of the UK. But once in Europe, of course, the key thing was to get through the airports to get into Europe. But once in Europe, it was just using trains, no cars, no flights, no airports, nothing. So you could just hop on, hop off trains. So it was just random travelling, literally, across Western Europe for a month. Disguises, only use cash, never pre-book a hotel because spies can track you. So it was very much a sort of gamekeeper turned poacher scenario because we knew how we would hunt ourselves if we were investigating us.
How did it feel to suddenly, effectively being against the UK government and being on the run?
It was going on the run was a very interesting experience. It actually felt much more like the cliched sort of idea of spy work than actually working on the inside had. We knew that we were being hunted by the Special Branch, Secret Police, and also by MI5. And we knew how we could try and hide ourselves, but even so, we were pretty high-level targets at that point. So we knew the extent of the resources they could use against us. So, for example, the primitive mobile phones could be triangulated. They could have recording devices put in them, that sort of thing. Primitive computers, you had to have an old-fashioned camera stuck on the top rather than integrated into it, could have keystroke loggers, could film you remotely, it could be switched on, but it was much more difficult for the spies to implement all that. Certainly by the time David and I were living in exile in Paris for 2 years before he came back to the UK, we knew that the flat was probably bugged, electronic communications were bugged, computers, phones, that sort of thing. We knew there was a possibility we might be followed around on the streets, and we also knew there was a possibility that some of our friends would be recruited to report back on us or pressured to report back on us, and that turned out to be the case. In terms of our long-term aims, though, we wanted to create a bit of a scandal, and there might be reforms and tightening up of the laws and the oversight of the spies. That's what we were aiming for. And in order to do that, we needed that bit of a scandal, and we'd sort of thought through what the spy response would be, which was they would take out gagging orders against the national media within the first week, which they did, which then meant that the national media got very angry and said, we're the free British press, we've got to have an inquiry into what the spies are doing. So it's all beginning to go fairly smoothly in terms of working towards what we wanted to achieve. Then a week after we went on the run, Princess Diana died in Paris, which sort of knocked every other piece of news out of the national media for weeks and weeks and weeks. So we lost all our protection, we lost the head of steam in terms of the press campaigning for greater oversight. So we ended up hiding in a remote French farmhouse for a year. And then David finally got the newspaper and BBC to go public about the Gaddafi plot, which was the main reason why he wanted to blow the whistle, in the summer of 1998. And immediately he was arrested when we were in Paris trying to break the story and thrown into prison because the British tried and failed to extradite him from Paris in that summer. He was in prison for about 4 months and released because he was deemed to be a political prisoner. And so we had another 2 years living more openly in exile in Paris. And then he went back voluntarily to face trial in 2000. Eventually, after a whole series of legal hearings, was put in front of a jury in 2002. And there is no legal defence under the Official Secrets Act for whistleblowing. So he was convicted and sent back to prison. Fortunately, though, in those days, the tariff for blowing the whistle was 2 years in prison per charge. What they're trying to do at the moment for both whistleblowers and journalists is up that to 14 years in prison per charge, which is huge. Anyway, so he served his time, he got out, paid his debt to society, and then we had to try and sort of rebuild our lives with no, career possibilities. And just after the experiences we'd had, I mean, the whole court case took 7 years, the whole case took 7 years in total. Sort of, well, what do we do now? Knowing what we know and having experienced what we experienced. So those were pretty rough years, and the stress killed our relationship as well. We separated in 2006.
Did you achieve anything of what you were planning to?
Well, we got a lot of information out. So there were various legal cases, including appeals for the 2 Palestinians who were wrongfully convicted. There was never a proper inquiry into the Gaddafi plot. And of course, Gaddafi himself survived to be assassinated in 2011 by the very same groups, backed by the very same people. But by 2011, it was all done in the glare of the media rather than in secret. But yeah, in terms of did we change anything? I hate to say it. I mean, for a few years, we gave them a good run for their money and raised a lot of questions about the nature of the Official Secrets Act and secrecy and privacy and surveillance and rights and subversion and, all that sort of stuff. But it doesn't change anything in the long term. And that's the tragedy, I think, for most whistleblowers, and particularly those coming out of intelligence agencies, because the mechanism of the apparatus of the state will grind on and on and on. And the whistleblowers, if they're lucky, will survive the process with their sanity and their liberty intact, but very little meaningful change. And everything that is now being discussed 25 years on is exactly the sort of stuff that was being discussed when we were blowing the whistle. So nothing has actually shifted.
I'm wondering what a whistleblowing scandal like yours would have looked like nowadays. How would it have been different?
I think the options for whistleblowers are vastly improved, or have been, over the last decade. There's no doubt about it. When I first heard about the WikiLeaks publishing model, I thought, oh, wow, I wish that had existed, 10 years previously, because WikiLeaks was set up, I think, in 2006, 2007, and only really hit major notoriety in 2010 with the Afghan war logs. So there are greater options, but also greater threats, I think, particularly for intelligence whistleblowers, because having a high-tech conduit like WikiLeaks, where you can anonymously put information out there and or then publicly own it, gives you greater control rather than having to go through the old mainstream media, which is what David and I had to do. However, the power of the surveillance state is exponentially bigger as well. So unless you've got sort of the tech skills on a par with someone like Edward Snowden, it would probably be virtually impossible to get classified information out there securely and go on the run preemptively to try and avoid arrest. So ironically, I think Edward Snowden, and even his case is 9 years old now, it was 2013 he came out, he's the only other whistleblower I've ever heard of coming out of the intelligence agencies who preemptively went on the run before the story broke. How you do it now, I don't know. With all the surveillance, I mean, people talk about Chinese surveillance, Russian state surveillance, all the rest of it, but actually what Edward Snowden revealed a decade ago is this sort of global panopticon of surveillance that is run by our Western democracies, which is astonishing. For a nation state or for a democracy, if everyone within that nation state feels they don't have a sense of privacy, they can't freely discuss or post or write or have freedom of conscience or whatever, then suddenly that actually becomes a bit of a police state, a bit like East Germany before the Berlin Wall came down. And that's how democracies begin to fray and democracy can end, and the slide towards totalitarianism of police states can begin.